Thank you and good morning. When Beth asked me to speak today, she asked me to address the question, should state SPMs be centralized? And in other words, should one agency or group compute SPMs for all the states and using a consistent methodology, or should each state and locality go about doing it on their own? And my answer was, well, both are important. We need both. So I thought what I would do is talk through the advantages of the centralized and decentralized approach, and then talk some more about issues in the question in the last session, and about how we might build or combine or make use of sharing of code or development building off of work done by other groups to simplify the work at the state and local level. And I'd just like to talk about, just how can we have the best of both worlds in terms of a centralized and decentralized approach. So advantages of a centralized approach, well, a very important one is that the results are then comparable across areas. When you have different groups doing computing SPM estimates using different methodologies in different places, you don't know how much of the difference has to do with differences in poverty, those areas, or difference in the methodology. Fewer resources can be required in total to generate the estimates. You don't have all the different groups trying to reinvent the wheel, go through the same steps to do their tax calculation, to do their immigrant imputation, et cetera. It can be all done at one place. With one producer of estimates, methods may receive more scrutiny because people would be then looking to one methodology rather than up to 50 or more. Possibly less chance for political influence. Of course, that depends on who's doing the work. If there's just one agency at the federal level doing it, it's a statistical group and independent, that might, you can have more confidence in that than possibly wondering about a group working within a governor's office that might be politically motivated in terms of the methodology that they adopt. Another advantage of a centralized approach, or just only having a centralized approach, is there's less potential confusion over competing numbers. That here we have, this source says poverty in my state is such and such, and this source says it's something completely different. Now for benefits of a decentralized approach. There can be greater focus on the inputs and populations of key importance in an area, better use of the administrative data available in that area, better attention to unique policies in that area. For example, if a state has a less common type of state tax credit, or example given for California, the SSI cash out program, which is unique in their state. And there can be a greater potential for attention to the details of the SPM at the sub-state level, which is important because lots of times states, as we've seen in the slides, they want to look at how does poverty vary across the different counties and areas of the state. And if you're doing centralized estimates for all states, it can be really hard to get into that kind of level of detail at the state level. With more players, there's more opportunity for innovation, sharing of insights and ideas, seeing sensitivity of different of results to different approaches. I thought I'd give you an example of how sensitive a result might be to a different approach. And so I'm going to compare, this comes from a study that we did at the Urban Institute for Community Advocates Public Policy Institute, where we were using the TRIM microsimulation model to estimate the effects of a set of anti-poverty proposals this group had put together. And as part of that, so we wanted to see what the effect on this is on poverty under the comprehensive SPM type measure. And so we generated that for Wisconsin, and in the appendix to our report, we compared the result that we got in TRIM to the result from the Wisconsin poverty measure. And you'll see this is for 2008. The TRIM estimate came out at a rate of 8. And Wisconsin measure down at the bottom was 11.2. So there's a difference that's driven by methodology. And so what we wanted to do is, in our appendix, we included as much as we could. We showed what are the sources of this difference in estimate and this decomposition analysis, so that people reviewing this would understand where the difference is coming from. So we found that most of the difference in these estimates could be explained by a use of different thresholds as the starting point for the analysis, a use of different geographic adjustments, The Wisconsin measure at that time, I don't know if it does now, but at that time anyway, did not include WIC, and so we removed WIC from our estimate to compare. And also the Wisconsin model did not correct for underreporting of SSI TANF for unemployment compensation, which is something we've done in our. We found that once we had moved in the direction of the Wisconsin measure on all of these things, we got to a difference of only 0.4 percentage points between our estimated poverty rate in Wisconsin. So this is just an example to show these methodological assumptions make a difference. So what are I'm going to now talk about sources of centralized estimates. And so we've got the Census Bureau, and what published so far, Kathy Schwartz used these 3 years of combined CPS data to produce state-level SPM estimates, and I think you'll be doing that, and she'll be doing that in a forthcoming report for using 2013 to 2015 data. In addition, there's the work that Trudy just mentioned, which is to generate all the missing SPM inputs, put them on the ACS or make them available with the ACS, so that states will have all of the information they needed to compute an SPM measure. They could then use that as the starting point if they wanted to focus in on particular aspects of those, like SNAP or tax or something, and improve it for their area. But things that they really didn't need to focus on so much, they could just adapt from the Census Bureau. So I think that's a really huge contribution. And it will make this more of affordable for different states to undertake. The TRIM model I wanted to discuss a little bit. It's another potential area for centralized estimates. And TRIM is and let me just tell you a little bit about TRIM in case for those of you who may not be familiar with the model. It's a highly detailed microsimulation model capturing the detailed rules both at the national and the state level of benefit and tax programs. It's not really a regression type of model, it's more of a calculator. So the model takes each household at a time, looks at the people in the household, divides them into filing units that are appropriate to a particular program being simulated. So for TANF, it might be one group of people. For SNAP, it might be a larger group of people or a different group of people. For tax unit, taxes, it might be a slightly different way of breaking up the household. So it figures out the filing unit for each program, and then steps through just as a caseworker would do or a tax preparer would do, looks at the income of the people in the household, looks at the family members, the demographic information, figures out are they eligible for this benefit? If so, how much are they eligible for? For programs where ACS reports participation like SNAP, if somebody who looks eligible for SNAP reports SNAP, we say, okay, you're on our SNAP caseload in the TRIM world. But there's, as we've heard, there's lots of underreporting of benefits. And so we adjust for that underreporting by taking additional eligibles who don't report participation and bringing them into the simulated caseload so that we come up to the targets according to administrative data on the size and characteristics of the caseload. So we wind up with, in the end, with a file where there's internal consistency at the household level, family level, between family income, benefits from various sources, taxes and tax credits, and we capture the interrelationships in these different programs. So if you're on TANF, that influences your SNAP benefit and your likelihood of being on SNAP, that sort of thing. This model is developed and maintained at the Urban Institute for over 40 years with primarily funding from HHS ASPE, and that's enabled us to develop this really rich database and code to do the policy simulations. An ACS version was funded by the Casey Foundation and MacArthur Foundation. And we've used that in several studies that you may be familiar with. I'm calling TRIM a centralized model in that we can use the same methodology for different states at the same time as capturing the differences in rules across those states, but the underlying methodology is the same. So we use this to look at the role of the safety net in 3 states, Georgia, Illinois, and Massachusetts, in a study cited here. And we've also gone in and done several other projects. These are for groups that have approached us and wanted us to use the model to develop estimates of their anti-poverty proposals. because of the way TRIM is designed, it's really constructed for these types of policy simulations. So you could go in and give someone, do an increase in the minimum wage, for example, give people higher wages, see how that flows through to affecting their TANF benefits or their required co-payment under their child care subsidy, or then SNAP, taxes, et cetera. So it brings all that together. In future, we have a grant from National Science Foundation to look into the feasibility of a state-based model that could be accessible to states and policy groups, so that these groups could do these simulations themselves. This is a long-term project. We're not near to having anything yet. Right now, like I say, it's a feasibility assessment. We'd really like to bring this as a tool to states and make it more broadly accessible. And I think a state, because we would be computing all of these elements that are important for the SPM, it's a state SPM type of estimates would be a likely byproduct of this effort. But again, that's really long time down the road. How do we have the best of both worlds, the centralized and decentralized? Well, I think I think it's great that we really do need this centralized estimates to have comparison across states, to look at how that changes perhaps over time, to look at the role of the safety net, how that differs across states. I think that's very important. I think it's also very important that states and localities that have the interest and resources to do so go in depth and create their own measures that are the best that they can make for their area, making the use of their data, and with particular attention to the populations of key interest and their sub-state areas. I think it's really, I see in conferences like this and just in general all along, the insights gained from the centralized and state local modeling efforts will continue to inform one another. So I was thinking about the question of, so if we're having centralized estimates and we're having state local efforts, are there still ways that we can make that work at the state and local level a bit more affordable, so we don't have several different groups or many different groups having to do the same thing, essentially figure out the same thing, even when there may not be all that much difference in policy for their states. So the work that Trudy's just described will go a long way towards doing that. For example, now a particular state might say, I don't need to worry about MOOP, I'll just go with what the Census Bureau has put on. Or I don't need to worry with a child care expense imputation, I'll just go with what the Census Bureau has done. So I think that'll be a good foundation and building block. I think what states in adopting something like that are going to need to think carefully about if they do go in and substitute one element, is there any sort of internal consistency sacrificed when one element of that approach is replaced and not others? That's a question I don't know if there would be or not. Another one would be, is the Census Bureau's work, has it been done in sufficient level of detail? Would it be reliable at the sub-state level with the Census Bureau or another approach, say the TRIM model, generating SNAP values or something like that? Is that going to be reliable at the sub-state level, depending on the methodology and how that was done? I think I'd really like to hear discussion about whether there's ways that we could have a centralized way of sharing code or sharing inputs. So beyond what the kinds of things that Trudy's talked about putting on the Census Bureau's file, I mean, I think they would put on the SPM unit flags, the tax information, all those things. But there might be other things that states might want to use as input to their models that could be useful to have in a central, or generate in a central way and share. One would be, say, an imputation of the immigrant status, of undocumented status. Another would be to use a program like TRIM to generate program eligibility flags and program filing units, because then if a state wanted to correct for underreporting, they could have that eligibility already determined using a model like TRIM. Or would there be a central place where states would share their code that they had generated to do some of these things? I think that this kind of sharing, I wanted to acknowledge there has been tremendous sharing, I think, and it's one thing that's really impressed me about working in this field. One thing I would just want to Fiza and Marissa, who are generating these these thresholds that we all use, we all rely on, and they're doing it without any dedicated funding. This is just a huge thing that we all benefit from. The work of Kathy and Trudy and others at the Census Bureau, we all build on that in our state modeling efforts, and I think it's really great. And I know that the state groups and local groups have been communicating with each other and sharing with each other and encouraging new entrants. I think that's great. I think there could be even more sharing with more dedicated funding and support to encourage that. And I think that I'd like to see more steps in that area to help new groups avoid the need to reinvent the wheel, really enable them to use their resources to target those areas, go beyond in those areas that are most important for their analyses. Thank you.